Before you begin this video, I want you to think about your self concept. How do you view yourself and how do you present yourself to others? I'm going to give an example to begin with before I really get into the lecture of someone who is really concerned with self presentation. Um, so, last a couple years ago, a few documentaries came out at the same time about the Fire Festival. And Billy McFarland, who is an entrepreneur who he co-founded the Fire Festival, is featured prominently in both of those documentaries. And what stood out to me watching as a psychologist was the extent to which Billy McFarland was obsessed with his self-image and self-presentation, to the point where whether he committed fraud or not is something that obviously he was charged with wire fraud, and many people think that he defrauded investors and defrauded the public with the Fire Festival, a failed festival in the middle of the Caribbean. Um, but regardless of your opinion, he was obsessed with self-presentation, to the point that it was his defining characteristic if you watch the documentaries. So what about you, right? What is your self-concept? And just like it seemed like Billy McFarland's extreme self-presentation contributed to how he took in information about the world, your self concept also changes how you take in information about the world. We'll talk about some of the ways that you can be more or less complex in your dealing with others. Talk about a few ways you can measure the self in psychology, and differentiate self awareness and self consciousness. So let's get right into it. Um, so the first thing I want to connect to in your self-concept is one of those tools of social psychology, accuracy versus efficiency. One of the reasons that we define ourselves based on the roles that we take on in life is that it allows us to have self schemas or driving principles that guide our behavior in many different situations. I think of myself as a good person. So rather than doing some kind of mental gymnastics every time I'm presented with a problem that I can solve, I think I'm a typically good person. What would a good person do in this scenario? I think of myself as a college professor. So when I'm presented with a scenario, when I'm interacting with other people, I think, well, what would a college professor do in this scenario? By taking those shortcuts and using the same shortcuts for yourself as you use for other people, you save a lot of time and energy. So, your self concept is a knowledge representation that contains knowledge about you, including your beliefs about your own personality traits, physical characteristics, abilities, values, goals, and roles, as well as knowledge that you exist as an individual. So your self concept is based on the reality of your physical condition, but is all your beliefs about your physical existence. Um, I want you to think about, so connecting to another tool of social psychology, which is that behavior is a function of person variables and environmental variables. I want you to think about how different parts of your self concept are activated in different situations. Um, do you feel the same self concepts when you're in church as when you're in the grocery store, as when you're in the classroom? I definitely can speak to myself. I'm very aware that I'm a college professor if I'm attending a conference or if I'm on UND's campus, but I'm not typically thinking of myself as a college professor when I'm at the grocery store or at a concert or at a comedy show or something. So your self schema is reflecting on whatever environment that you're in, and so that changes the behaviors that you'll engage in a given environment. um, We all know someone that some parts of their schema are so powerful that it affects them in every environment. I've known people, just to use my own example again, I've known people who are college professors that they act like a college professor when they're out at a party, when they're out at the bar, and when they're on campus. They're always ready to give you a lecture on something. They're always ready to begin, pontificating. For other people, their self schemas are more malleable from situation to situation. So I want you to connect very explicitly this week with the fact that behavior is a function of person variables and environmental variables. And it's definitely your self schema is something that you are carrying with you, but that's interacting with your personality. It's something that is interacting with you to create your behavior. So your behavior is your own personality interacting with the pressures that you're putting on yourself to behave a certain way in a certain environment. The environment is shaping your self schemas, and that is in turn shaping your behavior. So I want you to think of things like that. So, even if an action is consistent with your self concept personally, you may choose not to do it if it conflicts with your identity in another category. For example, if you personally think that taking a certain action is right, but your religion says that it's wrong, you are less likely to do it. This is another example of a person by situation interaction. If your identity of being part of a religion conflicts with your personal moral values, you have to choose which one do I go with. So I have a bunch of different affiliations that I carry with me at all times. And I have to constantly be choosing, am I doing what the other people in my life would want me to be doing? So I'm constantly having that social radar. Whenever I do something that my family would not approve of, I'm sharply aware of that, for example. So, self complexity. What is self complexity? People who have more complex social identities generally have more positive outcomes. So, if you hyper focus on just one identity, you box yourself into only handling problems one way. We all know that one friend who has really low self complexity, everything he does is about his fraternity. Every single thing he does. He eats food that his fraternity brothers suggested. He drinks the same things his fraternity brothers want him to drink. He takes the classes they suggest. Everything he does is for the fraternity. What happens if that person has to leave the fraternity for some reason? They've lost a big function, or sorry, a big social identity that plays a functional role in their life. If you don't have much self complexity, if your entire identity is based off one or two things, then if something threatens that part of your identity, you don't have other pieces of your identity to fall back on. So think about, in this example, Mark and Sally both drop out of college to take care of some personal issues. Mark, who's obsessed with his school identity, is not going to do too well when that school identity is taken away from him. But Sally, who does have a school identity, but also is a member of the church, also has ties to a volunteer organization. When she drops out of school, she has other pieces of her identity to fall back on. So it seems if you have a lot of different pieces of your identity, it provides a good buffer. So for good things happening to you, it makes you feel those good things better, but it doesn't have a great protective effect on you when bad events happen. So it's also better for people with high self-esteem and for better who have a high sense of control. They tend to recover better from bad events and they tend to experience good events more fully. So self complexity is good because if you have a lot of different identities, then you have a lot of different problem solving abilities that you can borrow from your different identities and have different identities to fall back on. So, how do psychologists study the self concept? Well, one is self report. Part of an assignment that you're probably doing this week is telling me a little bit about what you think of as your self identities. Another thing that we can attempt to do is try to see where is the self processed in the brain. I don't like what I put on this slide. Where is the self located in the brain? There's no one brain location that the self resides in, but a lot of processing, a lot of thinking and processing about the self does take place in the frontal lobe of your brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex. Funny enough, the prefrontal cortex is also where a lot of processing happens when you are thinking about other people. So the same part of your brain that is processing social information about other people is processing social information about you yourself. So we can also use cognitive psychology to examine how much you reflect on your self schemas. We know things, for example, like the cocktail party effect, which is where your attention can be sharply snapped into focus if something related to you happens in your environment. What's the cocktail party effect named after? That was such a boring definition. If you are out at a party and you hear someone talking across the room, you are likely not to be able to even pay attention to what that person is saying. If somebody yells banana from across the room, you won't even hear it. Your brain won't even register it. But if I'm in the room and somebody yells Travis, well, that's my first name. So my brain immediately snaps to attention. So when someone presents something that is relevant to your self schema, then you are much more likely to attend to it and process it. Another time this might happen is if we ask people to try to remember. So in one study from the 70s, people were asked to remember a set of vocabulary words, and they were asked to memorize these words by looking at the shape of the letters, by rhyming them with another word, by thinking of the meaning of the word, or by trying to relate the word to themselves in some way. And as you can see on the slide, the most recall of words happened when people connected them to something about themselves. And there was steadily less recall in the other conditions. So, to get your brain to process things more, connect it to yourself somehow. I want to make a connection here with the study habits that you should be doing for this class. If you can connect the things you're studying in class to something in your own real life, you are much more likely to remember the things. So that's a study hint. So what's the difference between self-consciousness and self-awareness? Self-awareness refers to the extent to which we are currently fixing our attention on our own self-concept. So I am increasing your self-awareness during this lecture by asking you questions about your self-concept. When your self-concept becomes highly accessible because our concerns about being observed and potentially judged by others, we experience a heightened state of publicly induced self-awareness called self-consciousness. So self-awareness is just thinking about yourself. Self-consciousness is when you are kind of embarrassed. You're thinking about you're being judged by others. So I could activate your self-awareness right now. You can, maybe pause the video and go through this activity. Write down your primary social identity, number one. And then number two, work with a partner, like a classmate or a family member, and have them write down what they think of as your primary social identity. And then number three, compare what you think of as your primary social identity with what someone else thinks of as your primary social identity. What you'll find is that when you have to work with somebody else, it increases your self-consciousness. Um, and don't be mean to yourself also in the instructions for that activity. Um, so how does being aware of our identity and increased self-awareness change behavior, right? That's what social psychology is all about. How does making you reflect on yourself change your behavior? Well, one thing that we have found in pretty simple mirror studies, if you set up an experimental situation where people have the chance to cheat in a study in order to give themselves more money. So psychologists will use this in a variety of different study situations. They will set up an experiment where you have to complete a series of puzzles and then report how many puzzles you completed and earn some money. What you can do is you can set this up so that it's totally anonymous, so that the participant can say that they completed 4 puzzles or 7 puzzles, even if they only completed 1 or 2. And psychologists can look at, well, how does the average number of puzzles change depending on whether it's anonymous or not? And it turns out if people are in an anonymous setting, they suddenly become much more able to complete puzzles. They earn a lot of money. What this is people are fudging the numbers and reporting that they complete more puzzles if it's anonymous and they're not being watched. But it's not just being anonymous or not that changes behavior. It's also if you put a mirror in front of people so that they have to look at themselves while they are completing these puzzles as part of an experiment, they are less likely to cheat. Um, a group of psychologists in the late 1970s also set up a situation where kids were able to take as much Halloween candy as they wanted. And they were told to take a certain amount. And if a mirror was placed in the vicinity, so they had to see themselves while they were taking candy, they were much more likely to take the correct amount. So being aware of yourself, even if it's just a mirror, you are aware of your own self, makes you cheat less. And this is part of a broader trend of when you become aware of your self-concept, you are more likely to be consistent with your self-concept. So if you think of yourself as an honest person, being aware of yourself makes you more honest. If you are someone who values safe driving, if I make you self-conscious, you'll slow down on the road and be a little more safe as a driver, for example. So if you want to make your behavior more consistent, just access your self-concept. Think about yourself. So on the other side of things, what happens when we reduce self-awareness? An extreme form of this is a process known as de-individuation. That's when you lose your sense of self-identity in favor of having a group identity. So losing yourself in a group can be a good thing or can be a bad thing. In a positive example, a basketball team all wears the same jerseys. This is a way for them to lose their sense of self-identity and increase their sense of group identity. And it makes them play better together as a team when they feel like they're working for the group rather than working for their own individual interests. But this can also be used for evil. A negative example is organizations like the KKK, which has robes and hats and outfits that make individuals in the group anonymous and promote them losing their sense of identity. So the group ends up, members of the group end up going against their own sense of morality and going with the group's sense of morality. They end up committing more acts of vandalism and violence as part of the group than they would individually. So they lose their self to the hatefulness of the group. So this intentional decrease in self-awareness can be used for good, can also be used for evil. Another topic in the self is self-esteem. So let's go through, we'll talk about what self-esteem is having high self-esteem good, talk about some other things that are related to self-esteem. So first of all, self-esteem is used so much in popular culture. It's kind of a catch-all term in pop culture that refers to high or low feelings that you have about yourself. This is originally something that was researched, and the term was created and then was researched by psychologists. Your sense of self-esteem is relatively stable over time. I think of it like your body temperature. Your body temperature tries to stay about the same over time, but it can go up or down a little bit if you walk into a cold room or you go out on a hot day. Self-esteem tends to stay about the same, but little adjustments happen when something happens to you. But unlike your body temperature, how stable self-esteem is varies from one person to the next. Some have more stable self-esteem than others. So how do we measure someone's self-esteem? Well, I've got two examples on the slide. On the left, we have an implicit, and on the right, we have a more explicit measure of self-esteem. So self-esteem can be measured directly by asking you, I feel that I have a number of good qualities. That's from the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. All in all, I am inclined to think that I am a failure. That is a reverse coded item. If you think that you're a failure generally, you probably have low self-esteem. Another technique we can use to measure self-esteem is an implicit association task. We have some examples of word pairings you might see on an IAT on the left. Now, an implicit association task, you would be presented with these word pairings one at a time and have to mark whether it's matching or not matching pairs. And what we find is that people with high self-esteem are faster to match themselves with positive words than negative words. So if we ask you to match yourself with positive words, you tend to do faster than having to match yourself with negative words. And we'll talk about more examples of IATs throughout the class. So what happens if your self-esteem gets threatened, right? The situation that you're in, the environment, excuse me, affects your self-esteem. If your self-esteem does go down, if it is threatened, then you tend to engage in more behaviors to boost your self-esteem back up. So if someone is making you feel bad about yourself, you're going to take opportunities to make yourself feel better. Now, self-esteem can be more stable or unstable. Some individuals have fragile self-esteem. If you have fragile self-esteem, this means that you may have high or low self-esteem, but it can be easily broken by events in your everyday life. So people that have fragile self-esteem might be unlikely to do things to boost their self-esteem because they're afraid of failure and afraid of what that will, how that will impact them, how that will take away what little self-esteem that they have. So self-esteem is something we can measure in any human culture, but it's not the same in every human culture. There are some cultures where the self-esteem of the culture is generally very high, and some where it's generally not so high. Um, the United States is a very individualistic culture. We place a lot of value on the individual versus the collective. And we are one of the countries that has a very high self-esteem level. Um, a lot of other countries have lower self-esteem than us. This isn't a bad thing. It helps explain behavioral differences in different cultures. High self-esteem is valued in the United States. So having high self-esteem is a good thing. Self-esteem is less valued in other cultures. So having high self-esteem can actually be viewed as a bad thing. Speaking of high versus low self-esteem, what did you hear growing up about bullies, like in elementary school? Are bullies, people who bully other people, do they have high or low self-esteem? What did you hear? Um, some people might hear differently, but when I was young, when I was a kid, I heard that bullies tend to have low self esteem. And so they are picking on other people in order to improve their self esteem. It turns out that's a myth. It turns out that bullies tend to have very high self esteem. It's what helps them pick on other people and think they can get away with it and not feel bad about it. Bullies have high self esteem, but sometimes they can have unstable self esteem. So they need to be constantly picking on other people to keep themselves feeling better. So people that have low self esteem tend to be more cautious and they don't engage in behaviors because they're afraid of rejection. Man, you think that that person is flirting with you and you could probably ask them out on a date and they would probably say yes. But if you've got low self esteem, you might not even ask them because that small chance that they'll tell you no and turn you down, it's really hurtful. So you don't go for it. So a couple other topics that are related to self-present or sorry, self-present. The topics that are related to self-esteem are self-monitoring and self-presentation. Self-monitoring is a degree to which you are aware of your own behavior on a day-to-day basis. To what extent do you place yourself under observation? So are you monitoring your own behavior to the degree to which it's consistent with your values? Some people go out their day and they don't think about their own behavior very much. Other people are constantly scrutinizing their own behavior. Another topic is self presentation, which is a degree to which you think it's important to present a certain side of yourself to other people. Self presentation can happen in a few different ways. Do you get up every morning and pick out a very particular outfit because you want to show a certain side of yourself to the world that day? You might be high in self presentation. Do you make sure to pick your words carefully so that you don't say the wrong thing to the wrong person? Might be an indication that you're high in self presentation. So, next, we'll talk about social comparisons, and I'll give some examples of upward and downward social comparisons. So, something that you can do to protect your own self image is to compare yourself to other people. There can be downward or upward social comparisons. Comparing yourself to other people using upward social comparisons is when you look to people who have more social status or more power than you do, and you try to find what you have in common with people who have more status than you. Downward social comparison is when you look to people who have less power than you and look to the ways that you don't have things in common with those people. So, someone that makes less money than you, someone that isn't as well liked as you try to exaggerate the differences between yourself and them. Now, another way you can protect your self image is by attribution theory, which we talked about other times in the class. Attributions are when you think about what causes certain behaviors. And it turns out that people in general, when they do something that makes them more successful or they do something successfully, they give their own personal attributes credit for that success. I passed the exam because I'm a smart person. But if people do something that ends up not succeeding or failing, then they blame external circumstances for causing that. So if I pass the test, it's because I'm very smart. But if I failed the test, it's not because I'm dumb. It's because the instructor made the test way too difficult. In line with this pattern, people tend to exaggerate their strengths and not focus on their weaknesses. People tend to think more about what makes them good and positive than things they need to improve upon. And finally, we tend to have a belief, we tend to have more of a belief that we're in control of certain situations when it is adaptive for us to do so. So we can only control so much in our lives. And if something is making us feel bad about our self image, we don't feel like we have as much control over it because that would create cognitive dissonance. Um, I think the last thing that I didn't have a separate slide for that I want to talk about is just the fact that there are cultural differences in self concept and self esteem, just connection point to other things that we've talked about in the lecture. Um, in the West, especially in the United States, we are an extremely individualistic culture that highly values self esteem and highly values a sense of individual self identity. This is opposed by other cultures that are more collectivistic, which have less of an emphasis on self esteem and more of an emphasis on group identity rather than individual identity. So I think that's where I'll end things here in this video. Thanks for your attention, everyone, and I'll talk to you next time.